not fair, and then the word wouldn't work. But it's particularly because these were coming out of areas where data could not necessarily be open. So, for example, sensitive data. So, but we needed to have, these kind of protocols, and these came from the notion of data. But why would this apply to workflows? Well, workflows are themselves digital objects. So we have the same issues in computational workflows. How can I find an existing workflow? How can I access them? Are they private? Are they on some Git repository? What language is it written in? Can I rework it? So can I not just reuse it, but can I repurpose it and edit it in some sort of way, or adapt it in some sort of way? Change the type of data, change the type of services, change the type of infrastructure I'm running on. Can I make it more, is it reproducible? That's much more useful to the workflow world than perhaps the data world. Is it well enough described so I can actually understand it? Can I reuse it in my own infrastructure? And in the HPC world, the answer is usually no, because it's so configured to the underlying HPC platforms. Also, as an instrument of often fair analysis, or as a fair pipeline, or even if we're doing AI or simulation, or so on, you're generating data. Is that data itself fair? So these are instruments of data analysis or data generation as well. Also, can I establish a claim for it when it's published? And this is about credit. So can I build up not just publication credit, but workflow engineering credit as well? So will I get credit, and can I track that credit? And that comes important later on. These are obviously things that will be interesting and fair to researchers and developers of workflows and developers of workflow management systems as well. You get your workflow management system, it continues to be used if you can evidence the fact that it's being used. So you need, and then if you evidence the fact it's being used, you can get money. And that's actually incredibly important, it turns out. But there's actually also a whole bunch of stakeholders with fair computational workflows that aren't the underlying researchers, who aren't the underlying developers. So they're the policymakers, they're the funders, they're the publishers. What workflow systems are being used? So at the moment, there are, when I started doing workflow systems with Khalid, where's Khalid in the room? Yeah, that's Khalid back in the day. There was like 5 or 6 workflow management systems. There's now 350, I think it is, open computational workflow management systems that are used in science. I mean, most of those, of course, are used by mainly the people who invented them, but there's a good bunch of them, like 30 or so, that are used extensively, right? So which workflow systems are used so that I can judge which ones will be funded or which ones should be adopted in my organization, because you're more likely to adopt a workflow platform, for example, or to use a workflow if everybody else is using it. What's the impact of it? Can they be reused and exchanged in order to avoid reinvention? Can we reproduce a publication result? So if I'm publishing a paper and there's a workflow associated with it, where is it? And can I inspect it? What's its provenance? Can I build a citation graph for workflows if I'm a publisher? Because publishers are driven by citation graphs. That's how they make their impact evidence, and their impact evidence is what drives their journals. What is the DOI for a workflow? And that's non-trivial, actually, because is the DOI for a workflow the paper that wrote about the workflow itself in a registry, the workflow in the GitHub, the second or third version of the workflow? You can end up with a whole galaxy of DOIs around one workflow. Well, then which workflow is it when I'm trying to create a citation, a profile for that workflow? So these are all interesting things around FAIR. Now, FAIR came from the data world. There's also, many of you will know the FAIR principles for research software, which was published, this one is published, was 2022. That came out of the Research Software Alliance, and the other two, that also came along with Force 11 and the RDA that developed the scientific data principles for FAIR data. When we think about workflows, not workflow management systems here, workflows. They are both software in the sense of they are descriptions of software, recipes of software, languages just expressing that could be executed by a software platform, but they're also epistemic artifacts in their own right, because they are descriptions of method, and they can be seen as such. So we in the Workflow Community Initiative have worked for the last, well, more or less 2.5 years, I would say, 3 years, on what are fair. And we took, rather than trying to invent some new principles, we took these two forces, these two sources, and looked at workflows as data objects and looked at them as software objects, and we applied the principles to the computational workflow world. And this is now published, and here's a link to an indicator of the paper. I won't go through the paper details. You can all rush off and read it and cite it and improve our H indexes. You can see there's a lot of people here, many of them who are here. Lou is here, Khalid's here. Sean is online, I see. He's up early to get online. And Sean really drove this forward, and we're deeply grateful for Sean's unfailing efforts here. But it's with a lot of different people from a lot of different countries. So this is a success of the Workflow Community Initiative. I would say we're one of the few very active actual working groups of the initiative, and we've actually produced results. So we're very proud of ourselves. Within that, you'll see, if you delve into the paper, we have to explicitly highlight the difference between a workflow specification. So what are the components, how are you expressing the language of the workflow? And of course, these different workflow systems do this in different ways. And the actual execution of the workflow, because these have different properties when you're talking about fair workflows. Are you talking about the fair workflow you executed that's now a evidence of an output that you want to put in a publication versus the specification that you want to reuse in different, repurpose in a different kind of way. So we talk about workflow runs as opposed to workflow specifications. Now, I'm not going to obviously go through all the principles because that would be really boring. But we've taken those principles, and you can see on the side, if it's red, it was drawn from the data, and if it's blue, it was drawn from the software. So they're a bit of a mix. Yeah, so it's things like finding the components of a workflow represent different levels of granularity that are assigned distinct identifiers. That came from software, because software is a compound objects, whereas a workflow is assigned a global identifier is universal across both kinds of data and software principles. So it's basically, again, metadata and identifiers. That's really what it's all about, with some tweaks. Now, associated with fair workflows is the whole notion, and in fact, it's in one of the F principles, that we say metadata and workflow are registered or indexed in a searchable fair resource. Now, that could be, you just describe the hell out of it and you let Google find it for you. That's a perfectly reasonable way to do it. But you can also have registries. And we have the WorkflowHub registry. WorkflowHub registry is a product of the European, a whole bunch of projects, and I was talking to Carole about this, came from originally a project called EOSC Life, but now it is an international product. Its product owner is Australian Biocommons, despite the fact that it's actually hosted and sponsored by the European Union, but we have many US partners as well. So this is a registry of workflows, and this allows you to keep, is a registry, it's not a repository. So you still have your workflows in your GitHub, but here you've registered them and you can couple them with your GitHub. So you can kind of constantly keep them up, the metadata up to date and the versions up to date, but you make them visible to different communities, and you can also create things like teams, enclaves, so that you can share workflows amongst yourselves, but you can also make them open. So you can also associate them with publications and so on. We've passed our 1,000th workflow registered. We're now up to 1,200 workflows. There are 332 teams yesterday when I looked, 26 different workflow languages represented in here. And you can mint DOIs, it manages versioning, it has rich metadata based on schema.org, has Git integration, and it also has workflow management system integration particularly if you adhere to the TRS APIs from the GA4GH, because you can automatically execute your workflow from here. But also we have something called RO Crate, which allows you to package your metadata and upload it and also export it. So we have different metadata migration mechanisms. Now, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about WorkflowHub. You can read about it in another paper at Scientific Data. So this paper has just been published on this particular infrastructure. So do join in, and you can talk to us later about it. So now we get to the policy bit, which is what Heike asked me to talk about. So what about policy? Okay, so great. We've got these workflow principles, Ray. Now we have to get them out there. So how do we get them out there? One mechanism is policy. Now, if you're familiar with Brian Nosek's strategy for culture change, he's one of the founders of the Center of Open Science and the Open Science Framework. He has this nice framing that says you have policy to make it required, but you have to have all these other things like incentives to make it rewarding, infrastructure to make it possible, skills and training to make it easy, and communities to make it normative. So you can't just say, we now have a policy that all your workflows will be fair. You have to have all these in place as well. Otherwise, it doesn't work, right? But also, even if you had all those things in place, it still wouldn't work without policy. So they're all deeply interconnected. So policy not only drives the whole concept, but it also drives things like, what is your policy around crediting and promoting your workflow makers, right, which is an incentive, in order to drive the incentives. So it's a cycle, right? So there's policies around incentives, there's policies around communities, within communities, there's policies around skills, and there's policies around infrastructure, right? So in order to be able to move from the fair workflows as a publication and an interesting exercise, we need to move now into affecting change in each of these areas, hence the culture for change. So who are our policy stakeholders we need to address for fair workflows? Well, policy forums, of which there are a large number. So, for example, the OECD is about to announce a software toolkit for a policy around open research software. This is terribly important. The OECD is a big organization, and and ministers listen to it. So it's written into policy. Then you can use this as a incentive for your policymakers at the national level to listen. Maybe not in the USA, sorry guys, but at the moment elsewhere you can certainly apply that, right? But also funders at the national level and so on, publishers, institutions. So you all live in national laboratories or universities, and it doesn't matter if there's international policies. If your local one doesn't do it, who cares? Because the local one is who promotes you and actually supports you. Communities themselves. And other societies. I've just come from this Elixir meeting. Elixir is a European research infrastructure for life science data. It has 25 countries in it. It has 400 organizations. It has a powerful voice. If you can get policy into that kind of organization, then you can drive change, and you can drive those change back down into the institutions that are members, but you can also lift it to the national and international levels. But you also need stakeholders around enablers to make policy, to say we should make our workflows fair. So training, so you need people to be taught when they're doing workflow design. You know, if you're running a course on Nextflow, that part of that course is how to do, make sure that your workflows are registered somewhere, or they have identifiers, they have appropriate metadata, and also the infrastructure providers. WorkflowHub is an infrastructure, but also we have those 300 and blah workflow management systems, their infrastructure. So how do we get them on board? So here, if I kind of put fair policy in the middle, if a fair policy is you need to register your workflow, then you need a workflow registry. But you also need to align it with things like code meta, which is metadata associated with software. So how does, and if workflows are software, how does it relate to workflow as a software artifact? If we have our policy that we need persistent identifiers for the workflows and for workflow versions, then we need to support that. But we also need to be able to support things like being able to make it easily citable. Well, citation.cff is a mechanism to put into your GitHub to put metadata in there in order to be able to support citation. WorkflowHub harvests that so that we can follow the appropriate protocol. So we need to, that's kind of implementation stuff. If you're saying that in fair policy, for your workflow runs, you must have metadata, provenance, and identifiers, then your workflow infrastructure has to produce the metadata and the PIDs and the history export. And it's remarkable how few workflow management systems actually do that, right? It's all internal stuff. And then we can go back out to the policy, because fair policy, fair is not an end, it's a means to an end, right? It's not actually the end itself. It's about how do I have more reusable data or reusable workflows in this particular case? How do I recognize authorship? How do I demonstrate reproducibility of workflows associated with publications? And so that is the ultimate policy. And most of the policy documents of these policy makers, like G7, UNESCO at the national level and so on, are around that. And FAIR is about a mechanism to support their policies. So this is how it's all interconnected. So, for example, community level guidance and policy. Who knows about NF Core? One person, right? Okay, but two people. But they're both people I work with, so that doesn't count. So NF Core is the bioinformatics community associated with the Nextflow workflow system, and they have guidance and policies around how you write the workflows. And NF Core is plugged into WorkflowHub. So NF Core workflows automatically get registered with WorkflowHub as well. And we have a similar sort of thing with Galaxy project. Who's heard of Galaxy? Oh, a few more people. Right, good. Yes. So you have both of these platforms support rich metadata. Both of these platforms expose that metadata. And actually both of them support this notion of a research object crate for metadata. Yeah. So those communities are making those workflow standards and making registration and adopting metadata technologies to make it normative, possible, and required. Now, the people who actually write the workflows don't know, and they don't care. They're writing a workflow, but underneath the infrastructure is providing the appropriate identifiers and metadata and connecting into an ecosystem of registries and other services in order to be able to support FAIR. That's what we mean by that. Publishers, here's GigaScience, that's one of the life sciences ones. In their policy, they have computational workflows should be placed in the WorkflowHub. So that's a policy document, and we're doing similar things with Nature, Elsevier, and so on. But then you need to be able to address things like what's the knock-on effect of that policy. Persistent identifier proliferation is one of the knock-on effects. How do we feed the knowledge graphs of the citation world? How do we avoid disrupting the publication process? Because no publisher will adopt a policy that affects their publication processes. At the institutional level, so here's Imperial College, they have policies around software. We can plug into our workflows in that, and that's to do with credit and institutional support. Again, each of these, how do we bring it to be normative, possible, required, and here rewarding? And with our infrastructure providers, as I was saying, we need to build in identifier minting, automated registration, metadata collection, standardization around that, in order to be able to support all these things. Now, this is the workflow management system world. If I was working in biodiversity, which I do, what is the workflow management system of biodiversity? Anyone? Who works with biodiversity? Nobody. I could tell you R, that's it, right? Maybe a bit of Nextflow, if you're being exotic, the little bit of Galaxy. 90% of it is a pile of R scripts you found down the back of a sofa. That is what the biodiversity world is. So that means WorkflowHub has to support bags of R, right? And many of you will go, but that's not a workflow system. Well, that's what people use. So then how do we get these rather high-flying ideas into those kind of platforms? And then we need to think, how are we going to then leverage all the different policy partnerships we can? There's a whole bunch of forums around, particularly now, around policy around software. There's the Research Software Policy Forum of RESA. There's the Committee for Scientific and Technological Policies, OECD. There's the Open Research Funders Group. There's the ADORE community, which is the funders of research software, which is led by the Dutch Science Centre. These were the ones I stopped writing after these. There's loads of these, right? Should we create our own WCI policy, or should we infiltrate theirs? And at the moment, we're infiltrating theirs. So we find out what they're doing, and then we add in workflow into their policies in order to be able to get an amplification effect of what we want to be able to do. So that's the end of my talk. I hope it was useful. I want to give acknowledgements to Sean, Johan, and Michael Crusoe, who's the CWL lead, and highlight this is the kind of vision that we're really looking for. The French, who's from France, apart from Khalid? So the French really lead the way in open science. They really, really have the notion of, they have an entire national plan for open science. They're the home of software heritage, for example. And this is the kind of thing that at the national level we need to go and work with in order to be able to get workflows recognised for all of our workflow management systems and our workflow makers. Okay, that's it. I'm done.